Having previously built a Game Boy Advance out of DSi junk leftovers, we decided to continue with this theme, but this time make it a little bit different. After scrummaging through our junk box, we noticed that we had a number of Wii remotes that were no longer used or could not be repaired. So a thought came to mind: would it be possible to build a handheld console out of leftover Wii remotes? So as always, we thought the perfect donor board would come from a Nintendo DS Lite console. This was due to its versatility and ability to play a number of gaming consoles. So we went about stripping down some junk Wii remotes. Obviously, one Wii remote wouldn't be enough for this build, so our plan was to strip down two and see if we could fuse them together. After some initial estimates, it was pretty clear that the Nintendo DS Lite motherboard would fit within two Wii controller housings. We then went about using slow set epoxy resin to fuse the two shell halves together, and marked out the location within the shell, as well as what components needed to be machined for the motherboard to fit. After extensive machining of the internals of the shell, we also reinforced it with some epoxy resin and bits of plastic. We then set our focus on the orientation of the LCD screen. Our initial thought was to use a leftover screen bezel as a template to the location and orientation of the LCD screen. This would also act as a template to machine out the hole. Once happy with the markings and location, we used the Dremel to cut out a neat hole for the original LCD screen. With the fitment of the electronics being so tight in this build, unfortunately we had to forego the LCD touch screen. We also had to trim out a segment of the directional keypad to ensure that it fit with the electronics inside. After a second test fitment, it was evident that we had to machine some more of the internals to ensure that the PCB fit. Before setting up the electronics for the directional pad and buttons, we focused our attention on trimming the rear of the shell. This would allow enough space for the cartridge slots, volume control, earphone jacks and power buttons. Once both halves of the shell were complete, we test fitted it one more time to ensure that the cartridge slots and volume control were accessible. We then set our focus on the button orientation. Our plan was to keep the original 1 and 2 buttons on the top and bottom of the shell, as we wanted this console to be DS Lite functional. Our plan was also to keep the power buttons as start and select buttons. And we wanted to retain as much of the Wii remote PCBs as possible to use for the directional and 1 and 2 buttons. We permanently connected the LCD screen and started the soldering process. After testing the internals of the original Wii remote controllers, it was evident that the LCD was still too thick for this to function. So we decided to trim down the boards into smaller segments. This would avoid the PCB touching the LCD screen on either side. This would also allow us enough room to mount a speaker where the original LED lights were at the bottom of the shell, as well as adding an aftermarket LED light. Once the initial soldering was complete, the battery was installed and it was time to test the console to see its basic functionality. Once happy with the electronics, our focus still remained on the rear of the shell, as after adding the LCD screen, the shell became thicker, so the rear had to be trimmed. This became a very time-consuming process, as we knew if we trimmed too much of the shell, it couldn't be repaired or replaced. Once trimming was complete and we were satisfied with the fitment, we then turned our focus on modernising the console. We thought a USB-C charging port would be ideal to bring this console to the 21st century. We felt that the perfect location was where the old nunchuck controller would connect to the remote. So we removed the original port and found a piece of original Nintendo plastic, which would then be machined to fit the USB-C port. With the end now in sight, the final part of the build was to install the rear trigger buttons, as well as the power button and screen swapping tactile button. To keep the console as original as possible, we recycled the rear touchpad from the Wii remote. This involved machining out the old PCB and sticking it in place, and then wiring it back to the original Nintendo DS Lite motherboard. The final part of the build was to ensure that all the wiring was sound and to insulate any components that could cause an electrical short. Before sealing it up, we also upgraded the firmware and the Wi-Fi chip. It was then just a matter of sealing up the console with the original screws before giving it its first test. So after weeks of fabrication, we finally completed the Wii DS, a portable handheld console made from junk parts with Nintendo DS Lite internals. The console retains its original directional key, as well as both sets of 1 and 2 buttons. Trigger buttons are located in the rear, power button on the top, as well as screen swapping capability. We've also added a USB-C charging port on the right of the console. The console also retains Gameboy Advance and its DS Lite cartridge slots. And the power buttons were retained for the start and select buttons to give it a nice clean look. If you're a fan of the original Wii controller, then you'll love this console. The aesthetics are a lot larger and more comfortable to use with adult hands. As most of you are aware, one of the downfalls of having a custom console was the audio. However, having the speaker mounted at the front of the console made the audio loud and clear. There are a couple of downfalls with this console. The first being the smaller rechargeable battery. We had to use a smaller 350 mAh battery to fit in this console, meaning we only have about 2 hours of gameplay. Also, the orientation of the 1 and 2 buttons are spaced fairly far apart, so adult hands are recommended when playing this console. With the firmware upgraded, and with the use of a flash card, the console is also capable of playing all your favourite retro games, which include Atari 2600, NES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, just to name a few. By retaining the original DS cartridge slot and flashing the firmware, your console is also capable of playing all your favourite DS games. With the addition of a tactile button located at the top of the shell, the console has screen swapping capabilities. This allows the player to swap between the top and bottom of the screen when playing DS games. We hope by watching this video, we've inspired you to create your own junk custom console. By recycling leftover pieces, you too can have your own custom one-off console. If you enjoyed this custom console, don't forget to check out the others on our YouTube channel. And while you're there, like and subscribe.